Welcome and thanks for tuning in, guys. Today we got something exciting for you. I've got a heat exchanger from XRT that I'm going to be installing on my Riot3 and two-stroke 300 KTM. Excited to try this out this season. Temp management has always been a pretty big challenge for the two-stroke, and with this system, I'm told and I'm hoping that it'll provide consistent temps throughout the winter in the snow environment that we run our snow bikes in. Traditional radiators don't really get the job done, so this is the approach that should work the best for us in theory, and we're going to give it a go. So I'm here at Lone Pine today. One of the guys the guy that helps me with my suspension work, and he's loaning the shop to me to help install this kit, and we're going to show you what it's all about, what the process entails in order to get a heat exchanger on your snow bike. Let's go. Alright, so here's the heat exchanger from XRT. Got some nice craftsmanship here. Looking pretty good. I've been talking to Dave quite a bit on the install process for this thing. Hoping that everything goes smooth throughout the install. Got some nice hoses that we're going to be throwing on there as well. And we're doing the catch can. So this is a total radiator delete. This will remove the radiators from the entire system and give us the opportunity to just solely rely on the heat exchanger, not have to worry about radiators. Bring a lot of weight towards the rear of the machine, as well as hopefully manage our cooling to the best we can. All right, we're gonna get into it. All right, first up, we're gonna be popping some screws on this Riot3. We're finding that we do have a few rivets we're gonna have to pull in order to get this tunnel off the machine. The best way to do this is to remove the tunnel and approach it from the underside to make sure that we drill our holes accurately and make sure we have a secure and proper fit for that heat exchanger there. So we're going to go ahead and start pulling some screws. One thing that's kind of nice on these new Timbersled kits, there's no loose nuts on the back side of any of this, so you can just pop these bolts out. This is a 13 mil bolt. There's a couple of those we need to pull to get this tunnel off. A couple under the tunnel. There we go. All right, so we remove all our Torx bolts. A few of our 13 mil as well as the one on the bottom. Underneath here, underneath the tunnel, there's two on each side. And you've got these 4 rivets. Once you get those out, you can remove the whole rear bumper assembly. And now our tunnel is free. And we can start working on attaching our heat exchanger. All right, our tunnel is removed. And Dave has a pretty nice graphs on his website, some graphics on there that lay out the dimensions of the tunnel cooler. So this heat exchanger and where the ports sit on the back of it. So I measured those out as close as I could get. Kind of knew where I wanted to put it, and I'm trying to get it as close to the front of the machine as possible, front of the skid. Marked out my center points as well as kind of traced the inlet and outlet. So we're going to take a step bit, and we're going to drill these holes. All right, taking the drill to the tunnel. So we're going to get a pilot hole started with a small bit and work our way up to our step bit and try to have this as centered as possible. Move on to the big bit. want to get yourself a decent step bit. Down to Ace Hardware, found this guy. This goes up to 1 inch, and we want to go to about 7/8. We're going to try that first before we go bigger and try to adjust this hole and see how that does, and see if we need to make any adjustments. Okay. Looking pretty good. Clean that up. Let's see how she does. All right, guys, so we've got our heat exchanger inlet outlet ports drilled into the tunnel, and the heat exchanger is now positioned. We use some double-sided Gorilla Tape to kind of just hold it in position while we drill our holes for the rivets. And we're using a 3/16 bit, and that's going to work with these rivets that I bought at Ace Hardware. Not expensive. They're actually say snowmobile rivets on them. Kind of cool. So you can take a look at those. Big head on it. And we're going to go ahead and pilot a hole, so a 3/16 hole. We're going to go through one side of the flange on one corner, and then we're going to try to do it on the other corner, so we can lock two sides down, two corners down, and get this thing secured so we can do the rest of them. The spacing on your rivets along the flange of the heat exchanger, Dave recommends going around 2.5 inches, so 2.5 inches per rivet. We'll mark those out once we get our corners kind of in place. And if you were to look into the flange of the heat exchanger, he actually has a relief line in there to kind of help with drilling and keep your drill bit centered. So he's doing what he can to make the process simpler on this install. And we're going to go ahead and get started and drill our first hole, put our first rivet in, and get things secured. There's one. Go. Just gotta use my He-Man shirt on that. One rivet down. Make it harder for this. There we go. Watch your eyeballs. So we got two corners done on the install with the rivets. Pretty solid. We're gonna go ahead and drill the rest of our holes and get the rest of our rivets installed. All right, we got all our rivet holes in. One thing you might notice is you're getting some burrs on the top of your tunnel from where you punch through with the drill bit. You can go up to a larger bit and just do a little cleanup on top of those, so your tops of your rivets just sit nice and flush on top of the tunnel. So I'm going to go ahead and do a bit of that. All right, guys, so we got the heat exchanger installed. It's on the tunnel. I've loosely remounted it back into the skid, into the frame of the Timbersled kit. So let's take a look at that real quick. So one of the things you want to make sure when installing one of these is that you have proper clearance between your track and the actual cooler. So you can see in there's well over an inch. Looking pretty solid. Should be good to go. And you can double check this prior to riveting and everything on, but definitely ideal. Want to make sure you got adequate clearance between the track and the bottom of the cooler. All right guys, so we're mounted up. Got her all bolted back together. Everything came together pretty clean. It was a little daunting at first looking into this project and seeing what I had to do. Removing the tunnel, had to figure it out. Got to commit to replacing some rivets, but after that, not a big deal. Some unique things about this cooler in this heat exchanger that XRT is making. It's quite different in design in terms of how the coolant flows through it. We've got an inlet and an outlet. A lot of traditional heat exchangers you'd see on a snowmobile and other equipment. Often the hot coolant goes through and then comes back to an outlet that's right near the inlet. And often the coolant is going through a channel right next to the hot coolant's going right next to a channel with the cold coolant. So you're not getting that efficient of heat transfer and cooling. So his design, it's all one channel. So you have an inlet and then you have an outlet. So you're maximizing the cooling efficiency of the cooler and getting the most efficiency out of it. It also allows them to make a smaller cooler. These are around like 14 inches or so. I think for his standard size, but he does make larger ones for bigger bore two strokes or bigger bore bikes that might need additional cooling. So cool product. So we're now mounted up. This is the hard part. Now we're gonna get into just running our plumbing, our hoses to the thermostat and any accessories that you might have going in there. So we'll get into that next. Before we get into actually plumbing this into the radiator system, we're gonna want to remove our gas tank, our seats. Not a bad idea to also pull your air box and intake track just to free up as much space as you can to make sure you're routing everything appropriately and kind of have your intake in place, how you're going to set the bike up for snow, so you know exactly where you want to put the hoses and keep things away from certain heat or pinch points, things like that. So we'll go through that process here and get back to you once we have the bike disassembled. Pretty much all the body work, the gas tank. I've also fully removed the air box. That time lapse maybe showed you a little bit of that. So I've got my intake in there now, so I kind of know where that's sitting and where I need to route my hoses for the coolant system. At this point, I'm going to drop the coolant out of the bike, and then we can start to work on the plumbing and get that going and see how this is all going to line up once we get all the coolant out of it and the radiator's off, and see how this thing comes together. We got our coolant out. Now we're going to move into the radiators. We're going to pull the radiators and all the hosing and the plumbing of the original system, because we're going to entirely replace that with the XRT heat exchanger system. So I'm going to go ahead, remove radiators, remove all our hosing. We've deleted our radiators, we've run our plumbing throughout the bike, and have our system installed. The XRT heat exchanger officially is installed. We're gonna run you through a little bit of the routing, which seemed to work the best for me on my 2019 300 XC KTM. And I'm using a 2023 Riot3. So the new arrows, the new Riots should be the same kind of chassis and frame design. So this should be pretty similar on the newer models. But this is how I found it to come together best. So you look here, we've got our input and output for coolant. So the coolant's gonna flow through here. It's gonna go through the heat exchanger and then back to the motor, nice and cool. I was able to route these through the frame here. Not really any sharp edges along here. There was one down here where it was gonna be contacting, so I added another piece of heater hose down there and zip tied it on and to hold the two hoses together, nice and clean. These are PEX fittings, a 3/4 inch PEX fitting brass, so just a couple hose clamps to hold that on, but turned out nice and clean there for those. Along here, again, some zip ties just to keep things nice and clean, no sharp points anywhere. Up next to the carburetor, should have plenty of room for the exhaust system throughout the bike and no contact points. Up and over the motor mount stay here, and another PEX brass fitting here, 3/4 inch into here. So the cold coolant's gonna flow through here and then back into the intake into the motor to cool the motor. This is our reservoir bottle here. So here's my thermostat. So coolant coming out of the motor is gonna come into here and go through this bypass and then into this bottle, which will be full of coolant. And until that thermostat opens, the coolant will just cycle through here and back into the motor, keeping temps warmer. But once that thermostat opens up, you're gonna see coolant flow through that hose along here and back into the heat exchanger where it gets cooled and then pumped into the motor through this line here, and it'll cool the motor that way. So I am looking at running some kind of insulation. It's kind of the same stuff you put on your windshield on a hot summer day. You can buy it just in a roll. And the goal with this is to fully enclose the motor so that the heat exchanger is doing all the work. We're not relying on snow contacting the motor to cool the motor. We should be able to get away with just the heat exchanger to cool the motor. It'll be a much more controlled system. That being said, we need to make sure the motor is totally enclosed and we're not introducing snow into the motor and getting spikes in temperatures that way. So I'm also going to build an enclosure back here. It's going to keep snow from flying off the track into the motor. Until we get out in the field and really test it to see if this is ideal or not, we'll let you know for sure. But this is a clean routing I find, and what's going to work for me for my first go on the snow. Next steps here. Gonna fill the system with coolant. There is a pretty specific bleeding process that XRT recommends. You can find that on their website. As we look here, the tunnel comes upward at an upward angle, potential to have a air pocket in the tunnel, the heat exchanger in the back here. So you need to make sure the front is elevated and that you're getting that system bled efficiently. So it may take a few bleeds, cycling the bike on and off and getting that coolant moved through the motor. If you can raise the front end, do that. You might be able to compress the rear end, get the air bubbles out that way too. So we'll go through that process, kind of let you know what's working and show you how it's done. So we've bled the system, ran it last night outside and changed some angles on the bike to make sure I tried to get as much air bubbles out of the system. Definitely it burped quite a bit. We're ready to do our official first test ride on this thing. Pretty excited. So I am gonna head out today. Buttoned up a few other things on the bike, such as the engine jacket, got the bodywork all back on, fully enclosed, the motor off front and back, trying to keep it isolated so the heat exchanger is doing all the work. That is the directions from Dave at XRT. So we're ready to test her out. Pretty excited about it. We'll see you on the trail and see how she performs.